go. We are right at the top of the hour, so I think we will go ahead and get started. I'm Joan Wade, the Executive Director for AESA, and would like to welcome everyone to our Federal Advocacy Update. And we are very glad to have all of you here with us. We are really getting prepared for a couple things. Of course, there's a new administration, and we want Noelle to tell us all about what's going on with the new administration, because I know she's got all the answers, right? Insider information, that's right. And we're also really trying to prepare those of you that are joining us for the Federal Advocacy Committee meeting. Just as a reminder, the Federal Advocacy Committee meeting is a really, really important meeting for AESA because it is where we set our federal advocacy agenda. And we really have a lot of input into giving Noelle and her team marching orders for what we want to get accomplished in Washington, D.C., at least what we want her to have input on. Things like that. So we really encourage all of our members to make sure we have at least one person from each state that can join that federal advocacy group. Your state can bring as many people as you want to the meeting, but if we would take a vote, we give one vote per state. So just know that coming into it. I am in the process of reaching out to those states that don't have someone signed up. So you may get an email from me after this meeting today. But for the most part, we've got pretty much the majority of the states are covered. So we're pretty excited about that. So I don't want to waste any time because I know there's so much going on in Washington, D.C. and a lot of updates. Noelle's shaking her head. We are interested in taking questions, although we didn't talk about that in advance. Noelle, you're always so gracious about taking Q&A after your presentation. So you can either put your questions in the chat box or raise your hand after the presentation, and we'll be sure to call on you and get you in. You can do that reaction on the bottom of the screen. You can see where you can raise your hand, and that's a good way for us to kind of monitor the people that are on with us today. So with that, the best federal advocate person in Washington, D.C. is with us today. We're proud to be with Noelle Ellerson-Ning, and thank you, Noelle. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. I think I'm going to do this right.
Very good. Can see
Boom.
it.
It's like it's been a year of Zoom or something, right? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Noelle Ellerson-Ing. I see a lot of friendly faces here. Depending on the news, sometimes I call you gluttons for punishment because hearing about the federal government for an hour can sometimes be monotonous, but there's a lot of information and a lot of news. So I will be sharing these slides with Joan, and I have some additional links that I'm going to drop in the chat that are relevant in terms of really good analysis. I'll put them in an email to Joan as well, but sometimes I like to drop things in real time because it's things you're going to want to open or look at. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and totally reiterate that as you have questions, please put them in the chat. I have 3 monitors going. So I have you guys on one and the chat on another, and we can do these in real time. So thank you for being here. And as always, the first thing that's really important when we talk about advocacy is knowing that your advocacy matters, and the time that you take to weigh in with your elected officials, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, matters. So a lot of you know that I have a team of 3 federally registered lobbyists, myself, Sasha Podolsky, and Chris Rogers, and I hold my colleagues in high esteem. They are good at their job. They like what they do. And in the same breath, at the same time, I can say, our work pales in comparison to the strength of your advocacy. When you take the time to weigh in, it matters. And luckily this summer, you know, I'm all about being an optimist. You want a silver lining. Betsy DeVos's egregiously incompetent interpretation of equitable services was defeated because of practitioner advocacy. You all were busy trying to run your educational service agencies and support the school districts you serve in the middle of a pandemic, and you took the time to weigh in. So a show of hands, how many of you wrote a letter, filed a comment, or emailed one of your members of Congress about equitable services and that money grab? Thank you. Your time that you took helped save over $1 billion for public education. If you ever wondered if your advocacy matters, there's your case study. So thank you for the time that you take to do advocacy. And if you're newer to AESA or newer to the advocacy work, don't be overwhelmed. One of the things that I would really like to reiterate for you is the importance of relying on your professional membership organizations, whether it's directly through your state ESA association or through AESA. It's often a member function of organizations to provide support around advocacy. And in this instance, you're looking at me. My staff's job is to be on top of, aware of, and ready to brief you on and respond to anything going on at the federal level that relates to advocacy. And what that really means is that way, when you want to engage in advocacy, we take the admin out of it. We've read the hundreds of pages of bills, we've distilled it down to what it means for you and what a likely or recommended response is. That way, when you sit down to write an email or do the outreach, you have the summary memo and you can just get right to the work of responding to the policy. So as you decide what your advocacy efforts are going to look like in 2021, it might be that you decide you just want to commit to reading the monthly update. That's regular education on a new topic. That's professional development. It might be that you decide this year you really want to engage on IDEA full funding because you know what a problem that's going to be budget-wise for some of the districts you serve. Whatever issue it is you decide you want to focus on, you're welcome to do the work on your own, and you're also encouraged to work collaboratively with your peers and ask us for what you need. So your advocacy matters, and we stand ready to serve and support you. So that ends the formal commercial and making the case for your advocacy, and we'll just get along with the regularly scheduled programming. So the rest of the content for today is an overview of the elections, touching and breezing through the new administration priorities, a recap of the legislation, the COVID responses that were passed into law last year, a recap of the fifth and final package, and then a quick run through of advocacy resources with plenty of time for Q&A. So in case you didn't know, and in case you missed it, 2020 was an election year. And 2020 was so 2020 and on brand that the 2020 elections played into 2021 because what else would go on? Because we had the Senate runoff elections with the Georgia seats. So what are we looking at in terms of an outcome? Well, we had a change in leadership at the White House. President Joe Biden and Madam Vice President Kamala Harris are now residing in the White House in the observatory and are the head of the federal government. The Democrats, even with the Democrats taking the White House, we did not see the down ticket spillover that was projected depending on what polls you read. And in fact, the majority for Democrats shrank in the House. So Democrats have a smaller margin, which really actually does help bolster Republicans to feel more empowered to push back on Democratic priorities. The Georgia election results were make or break. When we came out of election night, both Georgia seats were a toss-up. And at that point, that was going to be considered a win or progress because Georgia is historically a reliably red state. And to have both of those seats in a toss-up to runoff was in terms of turning a red state blue, that was seen as a partial victory for Democrats. A bunch of additional things happened between November 4th and the January 5th election, including the continued rollout of the pandemic, and then everything else that happened in November and December that I think helped further influence and mobilize voters. And ultimately, Georgia sending its first Black senator to DC and its first Jewish senator. And we now have a perfectly split Senate, 50-50 Democrat, Republican. And actually, fun fact, Democrats don't have the numeric majority, but they're brought to 50-50 because the independents caucus with the Democrats. So now when the independents caucus with the Democrats are tied 50-50, and in the instances of a tie like that, Madam Vice President Kamala Harris serves as president of the Senate and will come in and break those votes. A few other observations on the Senate, which is now held by the majority. Chuck Schumer might be the majority leader of the Senate, but you know who still probably drives the bus in the Senate? Mitch McConnell, because he has 50 Republicans. And when you look generally at how Democrats and Republicans mobilize, Republicans tend to be the party that's able to mobilize their members to vote in line or toe the party line and vote en masse. And Democrats tend to be a little bit more likely to be the party that's like herding cats. Case in point, the big negotiation over the past 10 days on the Senate side between Schumer and McConnell has been their power sharing agreement. They had a power sharing agreement before, which is what happens when you're split 50-50 or with a really razor thin majority. And in this instance, Mitch McConnell was saying that the inclusion of a proposal to eliminate the filibuster was a non-starter for him. Well, you know, Mitch McConnell is going to deliver all of his Republicans to oppose any such proposal, thereby stopping it. But in that instance, they would bring Kamala Harris in and she would vote for it, and the filibuster would not carry on. What happened, though, is McConnell didn't even need to do any real flexing because 2 Democrats broke off from the party position and said that they wouldn't vote to strike the filibuster. And so Mitch McConnell was able to get what he wanted by siphoning off 2 Democrat votes. And I think that is a case study of things that we can anticipate and look for as we go through the rest of this year, even with a Democratic trifecta of House, Senate, and White House. I will say, for the record, my favorite Congress is usually a split one, Republican and Senate. I find it ultimately harder when you're coming off a trifecta, whether it's Republican all the way through or Democrat all the way through, both in terms of what you end up getting out of the Hill and then the backswing for the subsequent Congress or White House. So I tend to prefer and find overall more moderate policies come with split government, but that's not what we have, so we'll see, and that's what I'm paid to monitor. Other leadership shifts. At the House Appropriations Committee, a reminder that the Appropriations Committee, they're the ones that have all the money. And so when we think about federal laws, you need the Authorizing Committee, which on the House side is Education and Labor, and on the Senate side is HELP, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So HELP and Ed and Labor, they write the laws, but those laws don't exist if they're not funded. So it's like having the permission slip and then the $10 to get in the zoo. You need both. And so the Appropriations Committee provides the $10 to get into the zoo. And so on the House side, we have new leadership at the head of the Appropriations Committee, and it's a name that's not new to any of us. It's Rosa DeLauro. If you're asking why that sounds familiar, she's been the chairwoman of our subcommittee, the LHHS, Labor, Health, Human Services, Education, and Other, which is where our funding comes from, for years. And so we now have this pro-public education, education-friendly chairwoman at the head of the overall Appropriations Committee. That's welcome news to our ears. On the Senate side, the Republican minority chair for the Senate Appropriations Committee is Susan Collins out of Maine, a longtime friend to education. We have some concerns sometimes. We go back and forth with her on her positioning over vouchers, but on education funding in general, she is, not education in general, she is a friend. So we're pleased to see her there. And on the Senate side, I should have updated this bullet. I made this before it was finalized last week. Richard Burr will be the ranking member on the Senate Health Committee. So Patty Murray out of Washington will be the chairwoman of the Health Committee, and Richard Burr will work with her as the co-chair. We are all kind of reminiscing and already missing the collaborative bipartisan work that Patty Murray and Lamar Alexander would get done. I think we can all agree that that was a model, statesman, collaborative, bipartisan working relationship. And I think it's something to aspire to. I think it's harder to aspire to as we see that both the left and the right are voting out their more moderate members, but we can always have aspirations because that's what we can work towards. And Richard Burr has been good to work with. We've had good positive working relationships with his office and my career. We just haven't seen him in a leadership role in this committee. So we will remain optimistic and look forward to seeing what comes down the pike. So the Biden administration, the first column is the list of his priorities outside of COVID. And, you know, on top of all of this, I should have added a bullet. The Biden administration delivered on their promise to staff the Department of Ed with an educator. And I will tell you, if you talked to me in November and December when we were waiting for the name of who he might nominate, I was almost rather obnoxious with reminding people that educator didn't mean it had to be a union card holding teacher, because there was long conversation about, oh, it'll be Lily from NEA, it'll be Randy from AFT. I had hesitations about that because I think that would have unnecessarily politicized the position. And I think coming off of everything that Betsy DeVos represented in that position and how divisive it became, I thought that pulling someone so high profile from a union would have been unnecessarily political. You could have put an educator who has been in a union in there, which is what President Biden has done, but they're not the head of the union. They're not necessarily as political in the union. But that is not what he did. He actually went ahead, and I'm glad you're all sitting down. He staffed his 2 senior K-12 positions, the head of the department as well, with career educators. Who'd have thunk? So we have Miguel Cardona coming out of Connecticut, a career educator with experience at the classroom district and state level. He is an AESA member. He actually belongs to a lot, or has belonged to a lot of professional organizations and has drawn on those networks. Has a short list, and that's how it was described to me by Hill staff and some reporters. They're saying he's kind of vanilla. And I'm kind of scratching my head and saying, well, did you really want a rocky road confirmation? I mean, I think there's something to be said for an educator who has built his career doing education, keeping his nose to the ground. I think he leads more from the middle and the back, not necessarily from the front in the spotlight. And that's why you don't necessarily see a long list. We don't anticipate his confirmation being all that contentious, and we do anticipate he'll be confirmed. His hearing was supposed to be today, but it's been pushed to next week. In terms of questions, I think the toughest ones from Democrats will be around his position on assessment and accountability waivers. We are in the position of supporting some flexibility around assessment and accountability. When Dr. Cardona was still in Connecticut, serving as the state chief there, he indicated that Connecticut was interested in maintaining the testing schedule as normal. We know, however, that President Biden has discussed the need for flexibility, and we know for a fact that both unions who enjoy a different level of access and voice weight with this administration are very clear on their support for flexibility. So I'm optimistic that we will get some relief around assessment and accountability. We are not doing any public press on that until after the confirmation, because strategically you don't want to blow up a confirmation for something that you want to see go through. So again, Democrats, we anticipate will come with some of those harder questions around assessment and accountability. From the right, I think we'll see some questions about the role of the department, the ability of Cardona to manage a department or agency of that size with the budget authority that it has, in large part because of the loan business, as well as questions related to regulatory work that the department will do. So in particular, I'm thinking of two regulations off the top of my head: the Title IX regulations on sexual harassment and discrimination, and the guidance on transgender bathrooms. So I think those will be some of the things you'll see addressed during the confirmation hearing. And now to all the content actually on the slide. What are some of the other Biden priorities? Significant increases in funding education, including a call to triple Title I. He calls for an infrastructure plan that includes $100 billion for education. He calls for universal preschool. I always confuse Hill staff and reporters because I say, well, universal preschool is really nice, but we don't have universal kindergarten. Are we going to have 5-year-olds on a gap year? Like, really, we do need to think about that. There's ways to solve that really quickly, but when you put that to them on the Hill, they have to think through that because we do not have universal pre-K. And then at the higher ed level, he is interested in the conversation around free community college. So we will look at all of these priorities. If we were going to dig a little deeper and wonk out on an issue, I would encourage you to get familiar with the wonderful world of reconciliation, which is an arcane budget procedure that allows the Congress to move a process or a policy proposal. It has to be fiduciary or fiscal in consequence, so it has to be mainly monetary driven. But you can move it with a simple majority vote instead of needing 60, which is, again, for all the reasons related to Mitch McConnell, important in the Senate. And we've seen a couple of areas where the Biden administration could use reconciliation, and that could include for the COVID-6 package, it could include the infrastructure package, it could include their energy proposals, it could include their response to the tax bill. So just stay tuned, we'll see how that moves. Now, specific to the Biden COVID-19 priorities, those are outlined on the right here. I think you've seen a lot of these start to be addressed. He had a strong week last week in rolling out priorities, both through just announcements and executive orders. If we were to compare Biden's first 100 days in COVID response to Trump's 100 first days in COVID response, I don't think that's really a fair exercise because Biden and his administration have a year's worth of information and data to draw from, respond to, and inform their work, including a year worth of watching what Trump did or didn't do and how that did or didn't work. So while Biden's first 100 days will look more coordinated, comprehensive, deliberate, and leadership centered, it's in part because he just has more information at his helm. I will say at the same time, though, that we have experienced that overall their plan appears to be more coherent and deliberate. So there's a little bit of all that at play, and that's what we're looking to see roll out during COVID-19. President Biden absolutely has an interest in pushing to get schools to be more open. He's talked about the first 100 days. They quickly realized, for multiple reasons, that might not be a good thing to enforce arbitrarily, like really just blindly saying 100 days we have to open because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, 100 days is really close in some states to the end of the school year. 100 days in a lot of states plops you right in the middle of test prep. So let's bring all the kids back from remote learning and then put them in schools to do testing. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we have taken the position that we support the call to make schools more open. We have the National COVID-19 School Response Dashboard that AESA is proud to support that has generally shown that there's 3 general observations that you can take away from that dashboard. I will conveniently drop that link in the chat for you now. The 3 big takeaways from this dashboard are: 1, that it is likely safer for schools to be more open than they currently are when there are mitigation strategies in place. 2, those mitigation strategies cost money. And 3, the ability and willingness of a school to open is absolutely correlated to and dependent upon the willingness and ability of the community to get its spread under control. And the data bears this out in the following manner. If you are a school district in a community that is seeing an uptick in your COVID rate, your school will likely see an uptick in its rate. Still at an overall lower level, but not surprisingly, school trends will mirror community trends. The same is true in the inverse. If you are in a community that's seeing decreasing rates, your schools will generally see decreasing rates. And so again, for those in the back of the room, the ability and willingness of schools to open is going to depend upon the broader community's willingness to prioritize opening schools. And this is absolutely a conversation about trade-offs. This is not an everybody can win here. I mean, when you're closing down schools and prioritizing containing community spread, that has consequences for business. It does. It absolutely does. And I say that, and like, if my husband was here, we share an office, he's in the hospitality restaurant business. For my business to thrive and for schools to open probably means not good things for his business. And that's just something your community has to answer and wrestle with. So I don't have that answer. If I did, I'd probably be doing a different gig, but it's a lay of the land and something we consider. This slide right here is a quick rip through all 5 bills that were passed into law, all during calendar year 2020. And they're the 5 COVID emergency supplementals. They provided different levels of funding to address different aspects of the pandemic. If I were to tell you to follow 3, they'd be the ones that included funding, support, or policy relief for education. So the second package, COVID 2, that's the bill that included the critical flexibility to allow school nutrition programs to operate even when schools were closed. That's also the bill that provided the mandate for paid leave. The rollout of that mandate was problematic because, get this, when mandating paid leave, so the federal government was saying, employers, you shall offer paid leave. Private employers, here's a tax credit for you to get it paid for so that you don't have to pay for it yourself. But public employers, you have to pay for it. So basically, it's like everyone shall provide paid leave, public employers, it's an unfunded mandate for you. More on that later, but that's where that provision came from. The third bill is the one you've heard the most talk about. That's the CARES Act. This was the pot of funding that included, among other things, $13 billion for K-12 education. This is where we had our little fun adventure related to equitable services. But by and large, this is the bulk of the funding from the federal government that's been made available to K-12 schools to date. The third bill that had funding for education was the 5th package overall. I call it COVID 5. Some people call it CARES 2. The full formal name is continued CAA. It's continued annual appropriations, something like that. Oh, it's right here. The Consolidated Appropriations Act, CAA, but I like to say COVID 5 and CARES 2 because basically it is CARES 2 just multiplied by 4 in terms of funding levels. So let's whip through what some of those funding issues were. This is a summary slide of the funding buckets. You got a pot of funding for education that totals about $80 billion. Now, oh wait, I went too far. No, I didn't, it's right there. So we have, oh, I got ahead of myself. Sorry, this is annual appropriations. I'm like, that's not the slide I thought it was. The COVID 5 package moved in tandem with the annual appropriations for federal fiscal year 21. FY21 is the year that started October 1st of 2020. And these are the dollars that'll be in schools for the 2021-2022 school year. The funding for FY21, which started on October 1st, wasn't signed into law until the end of December. You don't need to bother yourself with timelines. I mean, Congress didn't complete its work on time, but that's okay. Congress hasn't done that since the mid-90s. They have a series of mechanisms that allow themselves to buy more time so that we avoid a shutdown, and that's what Congress did, so that was fine. And what we ended up with was this overall final appropriations package that more or less was level funding for the Department of Ed. I've highlighted the 3 big programs that we follow: Title I, IDEA, career and technical education. Biggest boost went to CTE, saw a funding increase of about 4%. But overall, in large part because of the budget caps that stem from the 2011 Budget Control Act 10 years ago, there really wasn't any wiggle room for an increase. And in a year where we saw trillions of dollars going out through emergency supplementals, you weren't going to see an increase in annual appropriations. So, I mean, I think we'll see pretty quickly a return to a focus on fiscal restraint and responsibility and talk about the debt and deficit, because there was significant fiscal expenditure in those COVID 5 packages, those 5 COVID packages, and those dollars, those bills will come home to roost, and we'll need to be able to pay for them. So I don't have an answer for that either, but that will be a very real political pressure. And depending on how the first midterm elections go for Biden, could be an issue that could result in changes in leadership in either chamber. So stay tuned. So then we get to the COVID-5 package. And this is the slide I thought I was focusing on, which is the Education Stabilization Fund in CARES 2. This is the $54 billion pot of funding for K-12. Overall, education received $82 billion, split into 3 pots: a pot of funding for the governors, a pot of funding for K-12, and a pot of funding for higher ed. Big, major substantive difference between CARES 1 and CARES 2. There's no money for equitable services. So private schools can get money in CARES 2, but it's not via the equitable services mechanism. So what happens here is if private schools want to access funding through CARES 2, they have 2 choices. They can get money from Paycheck Protection Program, or they can get money from the governor's fund. But if you as a private school got money from PPP under CARES 1, you can't take this education funding. And we're okay with that, because that's essentially saying, hey, private schools, you're either a business or a school. You don't get to double dip in both. And same would hold true here. So if you're a private school that didn't get PPP in the first round, you can choose whether you want to take your money through PPP or through the governor's fund. Of the $4 billion available to the governors, nearly 3 of it, $2.75 billion, is set aside for private school use. At the K-12 level, you have $54 billion for K-12 education. That's approximately 4 times the overall funding level for from CARES. So you could use that as an approximation for what you expect at your state level. Conveniently dropped in the chat right now is a URL that has the state-by-state runs, along with, oh, I used to have a blog post to go with it, but I can't find that right now. And I'll just do this right now. Here's a handy side-by-side from the Department of Ed. It's a fact sheet on CARES 1 and CARES 2, just a good quick reference guide for both of those. The big thing I want you to take away from ESSERS and this $54 billion is that the intended flexibility. What I am increasingly hearing from members is, we're being told no. We're being told we can't use this for signing contract bonuses. We're being told we can't sign this for salary increases. We can't use this to recruit. We can't use this for X, Y, or Z. The default position that you should take from federal law should be that unless it is prohibited, it is allowed. So if you are being told that it is not an allowable use, I would encourage you to politely push back and say, thank you for that answer. Can you please point me to the statute, regulations, or guidance that says the answer is no? Because we want to find out if it's federal law or state law that they're using to inform that policy. I don't think they'll point you to federal law. I think if anything, they'll find that they thought the answer was no, but it's yes. Or what we've seen in a few instances is that there's additional state requirements that are in place. So the state has taken a position that it's not allowable. And that's fine, but I don't want the federal government to be blamed as being too prescriptive when in fact it was a state policy decision. So know that the intent is for broad flexibility to allow school districts and school districts to discern how they want to use those dollars. Okay, more on the Education Stabilization Fund. So the first bullet here talks about a provision related to employees and contractors. And this was a random issue that popped up in early March. And this was a provision that said anyone receiving these stabilization funds shall continue to pay employees and contractors. And this is a big concern to us because that seems to read that you must continue to pay employees and contractors, even if they're not providing services. So where this really became an issue was, you know, a lot of y'all were going to keep your employees on the books because generally speaking, it's easier and cheaper in the long run to keep people on the books and trained and certified than it is to let them go and then try to restaff, right? But on some of these contractors, so external janitor contracts, maybe some of you contract for bus services, maybe some of you contract for mental health supports. If those aren't being provided because the kids aren't in school, that might be a quick way to recoup some dollars, or if you're canceling the contract, or you didn't necessarily want to be obligated to have to spend the federal dollars. We were concerned that this language would have required that. And that's in part because shall versus may. Shall is a super powerful word. When I, as an advocate, see shall in a law, I usually get concerned because that means it's a mandate. You have to do it. It's a must. We tend to prefer to see the word may because may means, sure, you can do it if you want, but you don't have to. So shall was a problem, except it was accompanied by the extremely qualifying language, to the greatest extent practicable, which means, sure, you as a school district or an ESA who works with a school district, you're welcome to choose to use the money to pay your employees and contractors. But if you can demonstrate that it just didn't make fiscal sense, you have latitude to not have to honor those contracts. So that was a provision that does carry over, but the same interpretation applies. Maintenance of effort continues to be an issue. We were really pleased with the maintenance effort language we got written in, which is basically, hey, states, we know you're going to have to make some cuts, but you must cut education. You can't cut education disproportionately. We thought that was pretty fair. You can have the best state maintenance of effort language in the world. They went ahead and included a waiver. So states can apply and say, oops, precipitous fiscal decline. We can't maintain our effort. So we're really concerned about maintenance of effort. We've penned and we'll have national groups like AESA sign on to a letter expressing concern from the local level about states exercising maintenance of effort. And these pressures become doubly relevant right now. So for CARES 1, we had maintenance of effort concerns, but the education fund came with state funding. So states had their own pot of funding to kind of address whatever cuts they might have felt at the time. In CARES 2, we now have budgets that have serious cuts, and education has a bigger pot of funding, and the states got none. You know what that does for our pot of funding? It's a big X on the back. Because if you are a state legislature or state governor and you're facing precipitous fiscal decline, we've been told anywhere from 10 to 20% in some states, you're going to look at where you need to cut. And first of all, education is often one of your biggest budgets overall, but that's also the portion that can just be made whole by using federal dollars. Absolutely, you start to see why, when there's no other state funding available to help stave off cuts, the federal dollars come to look like something that you can backfill. So we are very clear and strong in wanting to ensure that if and when waivers are granted, it's in areas of greatest need and that states aren't allowed to backfill these dollars. There's funding for childcare, there's funding for unemployment insurance, and they did some stuff related to tax provisions. So that's all bulleted here and included for your reference. This is a quick one-pager that we made in coordination with the school business officials. This one-pager helped drive a lot of the funding discussion in terms of overall dollar amount that we're asking for. It demonstrated that on average, school districts will incur about $2 million in costs just in mitigation strategies alone to reopen. That was for last school year, not even this year. So it's likely higher. And then on this slide, on behalf of Sasha, Chris, and I, it's our distinct honor and privilege to work for and support you in your advocacy needs. This is our contact information. Never hesitate to reach out. You can follow us on Twitter if you want a steady stream of EduGeek information. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joan for Q&A.